official international author event. I'm Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, and we are really thrilled to be collaborating with the Mary L. Blood Memorial Library in Brownsville, Vermont, to bring you this conversation between Nuala O'Connor and Peter Money. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Michael Pryles is doing the tech end of things, so you may see his name pop up in a message in chat to you or whatever. We're going to ask you to keep your video off and your audio mute so we're not distracting to the speakers. And we recommend that you choose the speaker option on your computer screen and then turn the chat button on. And there you'll see links to the books and you can add your questions and comments. We will be recording this event and it usually goes up on our website about a week after the event. And if you go to our website, it's in the lower right-hand corner. There's all of our past events that we've been able to record. The format's pretty straightforward. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Peter, who will then introduce Nuala. Then they have their presentation. And towards the end, we're going to invite you to share your questions via the chat. Rather than raising your hand with this little icon-y thing at the bottom, we're just going to have you put your questions in chat, and I will then share them with our speakers. And so without further ado, we're going to begin. Peter Money earned his BA from Oberlin, an MLS from San Jose State University, and an MFA from Brooklyn College. He started his writing career in Dublin, Ireland as a 20-year-old student. He's published a number of books of poetry, and most recently a novel, Oh, When the Saints, which is right up here, which is a coming-of-age novel somewhat based on the time he spent as a student in Ireland. And it was during his time researching the novel that I understand he met up with Nuala over there. He is the founding director of Harbor Mountain Press, a not-for-profit publisher of poetry from near and far, and publishing such rising luminaries as Sharon White, Mario Susco, and Wendy Guerra. He's a man of many talents, and he also performs with Partridge Boswell and Nat Williams in the poetry band that's called Los Lorcos, and their debut album, Last Night in America, is available through the streaming services. And he's the village librarian in a 100-year-old rural library, the aforementioned Mary Blood Memorial Library in the town of Reading, where he lives with his family. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the screen over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Liza, and thank you, Norwich Bookstore and the Mary L. Blood Memorial Library in Brownsville. And thank you, Nuala, for joining us in Ireland live. Welcome to your green kin, Vermont, and welcome all of you. Nuala O'Connor joins us from County Galway, Ireland. Her fifth novel, Nora, is about Nora Barnacle, wife and muse to James Joyce. Out now in the US with HarperCollins, and in Ireland in April 2021 with New Island. Her chapbook of historical flash fiction, Birdie, was recently published by Arlen House. Nuala is the editor at the flash fiction e-zine Splonk. She's been praised by the Toronto Star, Publishers Weekly, Vogue, the Irish Times, the best books of the 21st century, and many others. More about Nuala O'Connor may be found at www.nualaoconnor.com. And welcome. I wanted to ask you first, it's been a strange year, obviously. And I want to ask you how things are going in Ireland with the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, we're on the highest lockdown at the moment, lockdown 5, which means we cannot go 5K outside of where we live, and nothing is open, basically. Supermarkets are open. You can get a takeaway coffee, but that's it. There's nothing open. No hairdressers, no bookstores, no cafes. So yeah, it's pretty serious stuff here.
Huh. Well, all the more welcome, because we're happy you can travel virtually with us. Nora's an interesting character. Why wouldn't she be? she was a human being. I like what she says. I guess it's well into the book. Nora says, Jim styles me his sleepy-eyed Nora, his squirrel girl, from the pages of Ibsen. I am pirate queen and cattle raider. I'm his blessed little blackguard. I am his auburn marauder. I'm his honorable barnacle goose. I think that's very salty sweet. And you yourself refer to her as, or I should say the narrator, refers to her as the best Galway girl. And I wonder if you can tell us about what it would be to be the best Galway girl.
I suppose for Nora, she represents Galway very well. Galway is it's a huge county, and it has sort of three very distinct parts, but the city is a very artistic place, renowned for its street theatre and things like that. It's a medieval port town. And then the hinterland of that is Connemara, this very ancient, very rugged, beautiful, mountainous seaside place. And Nora was from the heart of the city in Galway. She butted up, obviously, against societal norms by eloping with a man at the age of 20 to Europe. A lot of Irish immigrants went the other direction. They went west to America. Nora and Jim were different in that they went east to Europe. There's a sort of a West of Ireland maverick that we think of, maybe especially with women who are very feisty and very strong-willed and have great carriage. And Nora was all of those things. She was also very earthy. She had a very big heart. She had a natural optimism, which James Joyce, didn't have because of his own upbringing or circumstances or personality or all three, whatever. I think it's part nature, part nurture, isn't it? She was good-humoured and forthright. And in that sense, because of her pragmatism and natural good humour, she actually was the perfect life partner for James Joyce, who was not just a very cerebral person, but also quite a shy, sensitive person. He found people trickier than Nora did. He wasn't naturally gregarious, which is probably why he drank to excess. He was a habitual drinker. He drank every single day. So she was like, I suppose, water to his fire. She was the yin to his yang. They were a very good pairing. They boosted each other well.
I made a note that for Jim, she is hope. If he's chancy, she is hope, and that seems to be a constant in each as an aspiration. I mean, his chanciness and her hope. In fact, she says at some point, between hope and work, it's the strangest and most beautiful place I've been. And I wonder if you think that Nora's life would have been equally strange and beautiful had she stayed in Ireland.
I don't think so. Because of her upbringing, which was like most working class Catholics' upbringing, she left school at 12 years of age. There were no huge ambitions for women. And if you read Ulysses, you see this as well. Gertie, who's the girl on the beach in the Nausicaa episode, her ambition is to marry well. And for a lot of girls, that was the thing. Unless you were born into a middle class or upper middle class family, whereby you got further education, you left school at 12 and you got a job. It was the same for my mother in the 40s. And so I think Nora, had she not left Galway, and she left because her Uncle Tommy beat her for seeing a Protestant boy, and she basically ran away from Galway. Her grandmother who brought her up had already died. So I think Nora would have ended up as much like her mother, as a mass going, married with lots of children woman, living within a state that was increasingly wedded to the church, you know, and vice versa. And they ruled people into shame, basically. Fintan O'Toole reckoned that Nora freed Joyce from shame and snobbery. That's what Fintan O'Toole said in a documentary I watched about Joyce once. I thought it was a very interesting way to look at it. I have him say to her in the first chapter, Nora, you've no natural shame. Because it wasn't, much as it still sometimes isn't, it wasn't acceptable for a woman to be so in possession of herself so young. She was very confident. Both of them were very confident in their own way, and there was a meeting of confidence with them. You know, they were sensuous people, they loved their bodies, they loved to dress up, you know, and so they had a beautiful connection in that way. That was one of the first things. They kind of, there's a lovely quote from Brenda Maddox, who is Nora's biographer, and she wrote how a person can be taken with one glance. And she reckons Joyce and Nora were taken with each other with one glance. So they looked at each other and thought, oh yeah, nice, you know. And so that their initial attraction was physical. And then very quickly, Joyce discovered that this gorgeous auburn-haired woman with the erect carriage and the nice style and clothes and confidence also had a wealth of stories that he could then use in his work. She had a wonderful way of telling things. She had a sort of an unfiltered way of speaking. And she, like him, she loved to sing, and she loved, you know, just a sort of she had a bonhomie about her that was very natural and very Irish and very west of Ireland, in contrast to his maybe more urban sort of Dublin way of being.
Maybe it's true of most couples or all couples that they, certainly in the novel, we see very oppositional moments, many oppositional moments. At some points, we wonder if they even love each other at all, and yet I think we also find that, well, indeed they do, and they do fully. I think your point about the two of them freeing each other is really important, and my question was going to be, were they truly opposites? I still don't know. What?
Yeah, you see, I think they had a lot of stuff in common, you know, in that sort of that sensual matching that they had, the love of style. You know, he loved nothing better when he had money than to buy something beautiful for Nora. He bought her furs, he dressed her in tweeds, he had a beautiful ivory necklace made for her with words from his poem, The Winds of May, on it. Love is unhappy when love is away, he had inscribed on it. Incredibly thoughtful gift. He was generous by nature anyway, and she was generous by nature. And when they could keep a good table, she kept a beautiful home, and they loved nothing better than to make dinner for people, to have people around to drink wine, to sing. They often, even when they were at their very poorest in Trieste, they hired a piano. They had sing songs. There's a real, which is a very Irish thing to do. Every, you know, big night ends in everybody singing, you know. So they really had that sort of, that in common. Were they opposites? They were opposites in the sense that she was uneducated and he was educated. He had been to two of the top boys' schools, Clongowes Wood and Belvedere College. He had been to UCD, he got a degree, he had been to Paris to study. Like, these things were completely outside of Nora's realm. She was never going to be a person who had an education like that because of her family background. Her father was a baker, but he actually had a drink problem, similar to Joyce's father had a drink problem. And Nora's parents actually separated, but she had been removed to her grandmother's house before that anyway. She was the second of 8 children. And I think it was when her mother had twins, she had just too many babies to mind, and Nora was fostered out. Again, a very normal thing in Ireland. It was still going on probably still does go on, but like even when I was a child, it was very normal for someone to live with their granny, even though their family was down the road. It just was one of those things that happened here. So yeah, so she was essentially brought up as an only child, which made her a little bit removed from her family. Probably had all the attention of her grandmother, who, there's a beautiful picture of her grandmother, and she looks like this is her maternal grandmother, again, a very striking looking woman. You know, there's a sort of a pride. I know that these photographs are taken when everybody's wearing their best clothes and what have you, but you know, she just looks really sort of proud of herself. And I brought that into the book as much as you can. I find photographs useful in that sense, even though I know myself, photographs don't tell the whole story. When you're researching a novel like this, you can decide to glean a lot from photographs about people's expressions and stuff, and the type of clothes they're wearing. So I'm probably gone completely off piste there, but were they opposites? Yes. Were they complementary? Yes.
Yeah, and so much of what we read, because we're reading her life and we're reading her life in her head, we're not reading her early life, but it's also, there is a coming of age. There's a coming of age and age and age.
Mm-hmm.
And we're reading opposition, we're reading catharsis. Were there some scenes that were actually difficult to write? Either because it brought up something. Well, I'm thinking about this. There's, not to give anything away, but we read Nora throughout her life, basically, and I'm assuming there were some moments that were more difficult than others.
Mm-hmm. I suppose one of the challenges of writing a biofictional novel is that you're trying to keep to a timeline. You're doing two things. Well, I am, as a biofictional novelist. I'm being faithful, but I'm also festooning. Okay, so I'm keeping to the dates and to things I know happen, but I'm also inventing an interior life for someone who I don't have access to their mind. So I'm inventing scenes, I'm inventing emotionality, I'm inventing attitudes. So all of that you're trying to do while at the same time get the dialogue and the timing correct. And by the timing, I mean the actual chronology of their lives. Joyce and Nora moved house constantly. It was constant. It may have been a throwback to his peripatetic childhood, where they literally had to flee bailiffs and landlords because his father had, drank away the rent. So they moved a lot. And, my agent, who always gives the first read through of my novel, said, "Oh my goodness, you have to take out some of these moves. It's relentless. It's too much," So then I have to remove places from my chronology while still keeping things in line. So sometimes I just wanted to write scenes, but I had to do a lot of very tricky research and making sure. So that I would find difficult, especially considering I chose the span I chose right to the end of her life. And then the other thing I guess that was tricky was Lucia, their daughter, was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Hebephrenic schizophrenia, I think, is the correct term that they used at the time, when she was in her 20s. And that was a diagnosis. She saw more than 20 doctors. James Joyce was very determined to get her cured, inverted commas. Like some doctors thought maybe she had hormonal issues, and then others were going down the schizophrenia route. We don't know today what she would have been diagnosed as. It's hard to know. She had, a lot of different, she had violent tendencies. She had truancy tendencies. She would disappear for 3 days at a time and they would be worried sick. She was committed over and over and then brought home for Nora to mind her, which was difficult because she was violent. She would paint her face black with ink. She would set fires in her bedroom and in the asylum. So she had a lot of, she was ill. So I had to do a lot of research and careful research around this stuff that I don't know anything about, not being a medical person. And try to honor Lucia and try to honor Nora and Jim as well in their minding of Lucia, in their concern for her, and not to demonize anyone, because it was a situation that any of us could be in. And Nora has been demonized by other authors, very much so. And I was having none of that as a mother and as someone who knew them as a family of four who were extremely close, extremely tight. They were like their own little island. You know, at one point, James Joyce told someone that family was all that mattered to him. And he meant himself, Nora, Giorgio and Lucia. He didn't mean his extended family, he meant us four.
Mm.
And they clearly had great relationships. You can tell that from their letters.
There's far more struggle in their life than I think most people who appreciate James Joyce and that whole aura would have any understanding of. I mean, they faced a war, they faced fever, they faced mental illness in the family, and having to move around. Would you like to read a portion now?
Sure, I'll just read a little sample so that people can get a feel for the text. So it's Nora's point of view, it's Nora's story. Obviously Jim is there. They were very close, they hardly ever spent any time apart. I'll just read a teeny bit from where they have decided to elope. So they've only known each other since June, and it's now October the 8th, 1904, and they've decided to run away together. Jim was in flux when Nora met him. His mother had died, he was grieving badly. He didn't want to stay at home with his father. The poverty was, it was really horrendous. And he wanted to get away. He disdained Holy Catholic Ireland and its grip on people. He blamed it for killing his mother. So they've decided to elope. Jim's family think he's leaving alone to go to Zurich to teach English. And Nora has told nobody that she's leaving, bar a girl who works with her who she's borrowed a coat from. So here Nora is on the boat and she's waiting for Jim. The air is salt, sweet and cool. The portholes beam light into the dusk. The deck throngs with those aching to stay and those like me aching to go. My legs and my will seem determined to take me farther east and farther again, away from Galway, away now from Dublin, to the continent, to Zurich, where Jim has secured a teaching post. Jim comes aboard at last, and I see him dip through the crowd, straining his neck to find me where we agreed to meet. Jim, I call, waving my hand over my head, Jim! His face collapses in relief and he comes, drops the trunk he's been struggling to drag and embraces me. This is it now, Nora. Nulla retrorsum, no going back. Then we'll face forward, my love, I say. We turn to the open sea and all that lies beyond. Standing side by side, we watch twilight descend. Jim's fizzling, giddy, smoking cigarette after cigarette. He tosses the butts to the gulls who keen like mourning women. The boat begins its slow move away from the dock. We're off now, Nora. Yes, Jim, we certainly are. We stay at the ship's rail, our backs to Ireland. Good riddance to the old sow, he says. No self-respecting man stays in Ireland. There's nothing more natural to the Irish, he says, than the leaving of their home, all the better to weep for her. My guts churn and I start to cry. Oh, Nora, Nora, have I alarmed you? Are you sad to go, my darling? I shake my head. I'm all right, Jim, I'm grand. It's not that I'm pained. It's more like a wash of ease and certainty basting my heart. Jim and I are alone together at last. Away from Galway and Uncle Tommy and Mammy, away from Dublin and Cosgrave and Gogarty and Jim's pappy and his brother Stanny and all the rest of his large grasping family. It feels good to leave them all behind on the island. I weep and the salt of my tears buoys me, as sure as if they were the sea and I a bouncing lump of jetsam. How can I explain that I'm happier than I've ever been? Happy that Jim has let me share this journey, that we will be joined now, if not in marriage, at least in trust. I look at Jim and laugh, tears still bubbling from my eyes. He pulls me close to him and he laughs too. Yes, I'm happy. I'm as easy and free and content now as a goose on the wing, looking for a soft place to fall. That's Nora, excited about her journey.
And no going back. I have a couple questions. One relates to what Galway would have been like for her as a girl. Would there still have been, an emotional pull? It doesn't sound like it, but I know for most people know Galway as a small city, and parts of that old Galway probably still remain. Um, I want her to love her old Galway, but I realize
Yeah.
I realize they're off and they're away. And in fact, at some point in the novel, she she talks about her disdain for Ireland. I think that's actually around her husband's papers, the archives.
Yeah.
How do we understand, especially here in well, I don't know, we're zooming in from all over, but let's say Aaron file readers may find it strange that there was disdain for Ireland among between Nora and Jim. Can you help us
Yeah, I
understand that?
guess when they decided to make their escape, they made it. Now, things weren't hugely rosy for them in Trieste for the first couple of years. Nora hated the heat. She disliked the food. She found it greasy. They did at one point think of returning to Ireland, to Dublin maybe, and renting a little cottage with Jim's brother. They missed Irish food. Nora didn't miss her family as such. The woman who'd brought her up was dead. She'd had a fight with her uncle. She wasn't that close to her mother. But as the years went by, when Nora's father died, she wanted to come home because she was afraid her mother would die and she wouldn't see her again. So relations were renewed. So Nora came back twice and loved being with her sisters and her mother and listening to them gossip and what have you. But she was European now. She was different. I don't know if you've ever, well, you have, Peter, you have lived in Dublin. But when you come back, when you went back to the States, you feel the air pressing about you incorrectly when you return, having emigrated for a while. You come back and you have changed because you've had to be challenged. You come back and everything feels something the same and something moved on, and you're a bit discombobulated because you don't belong anymore. Like that contrast between Trieste and coming back to Ireland must have been enormous. This was an Ireland heading into civil war. This was an Ireland that didn't have an industrial revolution. And so people were still relying on the land, on fishing and on farming, subsistence farming. And it was still a place of great poverty. The political changes meant that the church and state were colluding even more, having even more control over people's lives. And Nora and Jim were coming back to this from the jewel of the Adriatic, Trieste, this magnificent port town that was really, really multicultural, like really multicultural in a way that a lot of other places weren't. I've been there and the light is incredible. The piazza is enormous. Everything is white. Everything is, you feel uplifted. You know the way a church is designed to uplift you. Trieste uplifts a person. Now, they knew poverty there at the start, but they were okay. He had a job in Trieste teaching in the Berlitz school. And then they brought Stanny over. At its worst, they brought him over to support their lifestyle. It was also an opportunity for Stanny. He wasn't going to thrive in Dublin. He was working as a clerk of some kind and unhappy and supporting his father and sisters and like really in a sort of a miserable position. So they changed his life by bringing him over, but he was still, there's a really sharp quote from Stanny where he said about Jim, he uses me as a butcher uses his steel. Stanny was a great friend to Jim, but he didn't get much out of the bargain, if you know what I mean. He always got the shitty end of the Jim stick, let's put it that way. So when they came back to Ireland, they really felt keenly how they had changed. And they had changed. They'd become extremely independent. The disdain I suppose Jim always had it. He wasn't a practicing Catholic. Nora was a little bit more wedded still to the idea of Catholicism. But, you know, when there was an entire debacle around Dubliners being published in Ireland. Printers, not even publishers, querying words that they didn't like. You know, Joyce was told you'll be sued by certain pubs that are mentioned. Like, it was he had an awful time. And in the end, the book was destroyed, all the copies that had been printed. And he was just furious. He said, I'm never publishing in Ireland. That's it. So he had a book out. Chamber Music was his first book of poetry. And that came out. That was his first book. And after that, he published in London and Paris and America and elsewhere, not in Ireland. So there was a kind of Ireland let him down. And he felt that very keenly. And Nora felt it then when Jim died and they wouldn't repatriate his body, she was furious.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, was that just a logistical thing?
With Ireland?
Yeah.
No, he had written Ulysses, and it was, I mean, you know, even by today's standards, it is quite frank, outrageously frank and filthy. Like the Circe episode, the one set in Nighttown where they go around the brothels. I mean, it's bonkers. It's brilliant. But like, when you consider this came out in 1922, and was kind of banned all over. Interestingly, it wasn't banned in Ireland. It just never made it past customs, so you couldn't buy it in Ireland. You know, they just saw him as a reprobate, really, like, that wrote these, you know, terrible books, which of course were recognized outside of Ireland as works of genius, which they were.
So despite the trouble he had with printers and publishers in Ireland, and I think in England too, there's some wrangling, help us overcome this sense that his fame happened very easily. I mean, despite the struggles, and okay, he had to find work and they moved around a bit, but it almost seems like, I mean, we want to imbue his life with a sort of ease of fame because we already know what became of him. I don't know if I'm being clear about that, but he kind of goes from struggling to now he's celebrating. Was it more easily had then?
I think, you know, this is the big thing, isn't it, about Joyce? He left Ireland and then made Ireland really famous and clearly loved Ireland. I think it was Edna O'Brien who said Nora wanted to be Irish without living in Ireland. And you could say the same for James Joyce. He wrote love letter after love letter after love letter to the city and country of his birth, but he couldn't live here, you know, and one knows why. The Catholic Church, and it's just rampant, you know. You know, if you look at people as a pie, the Catholic Church has its fingers in your pie and it will not take them out, you know. And he just couldn't stick for that. It just wasn't what he wanted from life. You know, there's a great quote from Glennon Doyle, and she talks about you know, living your most true and beautiful life. And how do you do that? Well, Joyce strove to do that. Like, we're all striving, we all strive, but they strove to have something different. It was very much his idea. You know, he asked Nora to come with him and she said yes, in a great leap of faith, especially for someone of that time. I suppose he would not agree with you that fame came easily. When you think about some of the places they lived that were just absolutely awful, you know, furniture held together with spit, as Lucia said about one place, the mice that infested their homes in Zurich, the mud floors of the homes in Zurich. They had a 2-room place that was pretty awful. But they were always operating on a budget until the sponsors came good. You know, people like Harriet Weaver, Sylvia Beach, and is a Rockefeller McCormack in Zurich who gave a stipend, you know, and Joyce managed to find out who it was. These fantastic women who were literary, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not sponsor.
Patron.
Patron is the word, yeah. And, you know, he had all those wrangles with publishing houses, with Ulysses being serialized illegally in the States, you know, court cases with magazines who published extracts and then were brought to court for obscenity and all of this sort of stuff. So I'd say he would think it came fairly hard. And, you know, Dubliners was written a long time before it was published in 1914. You know, there was a lot of toing and froing. I think sometimes when somebody gets famous, we can look at them and go, oh, look how easy that was. And we literally don't see the struggles. Like when I tell people that I'm rejected all the time, and I'm not just talking about stories, I'm talking about my novels are rejected, you know, they're kind of like, oh, really? You know, oh, we thought you just had it so easy because you're so prolific, as they see it, you know. But you know, every writer has these struggles unless they're extremely lucky at the start, you know, to meet exactly the right editor and exactly the right agent. For most of us, that doesn't happen.
This misery loves that company. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about your novel, Nora, and it's one of the most beautiful things and significant things that Nora herself brings to the relationship. And in your handling of Nora's voice, we, maybe for the first time, many of us really begin to understand the struggle. And we also, I think, begin to identify with them as a couple. So if there is a gap between the name and success, what your novel is doing and what Nora has done is it's kind of filled those bookends with this humanity and crisis and joy. And I mean, the book begins at you know, at a place that some movies and other books might not bother to begin with until, you know, chapter 8 or 13. and there's something gorgeous about that too, because what follows is, as you say, a lot of difficulty. And I think it makes it much more easy for us to relate to Nora, especially in a time of pandemic as we are. We it's beautiful that way. And I think Kevin Barry, I read a quote recently where he's talking about, and it's common for us to talk about books as modes of travel, and he does, and especially in this time, I think your novel Nora is sort of a quintessential uplifter, but also mutual identification, misery loves company kind of a piece. Have you been hearing that from people that, oh, this is, if I had to pick up a book during the tail end of pandemic, knock on wood, this too will help?
Yeah, there was a Twitter conversation about the travel thing, you know, and how people literally felt transported to Trieste and Paris and what have you. As an Irish writer, I'm obsessed with place. You know what we're like. We all want to own our little piece of land or our house or whatever. We're very, everybody in Ireland wants to own their own house. We're just obsessed with it. And I really believe if I'm going to read a novel set in London or Berlin or Paris or wherever, that I need to inhabit that space. So I need the architecture to affect me. I need the ground under the people's feet to feel like the ground is under my feet. I want to inhabit. And I think describing a place well, the taste, sound, smells, all the sensual stuff is what makes atmosphere, makes it feel authentic. I need that from my reading. And when I don't get it, I get quite bored. So I'm very determined as a writer to put it in. There's a wonderful writer who I really admire, both for his historical fiction and his contemporary fiction, Andrew Miller, a writer from the UK, Bath. I think he lives in Bath. I interviewed him. And he talks about his writing practice in general. And he says, eyes open, heart open, feet on the ground. And for me, that's like my little mantra. I had that quote above my desk for years. I heard him say this in Listowel, and I think as a writer, that's what I want to be when I go to a place. And I did go to Trieste, and I went to Zurich, and I went to Paris. I actually was lucky enough to get a month-long residency in Paris, and I finished the novel there, and I literally walked around where they had lived. They had 19 addresses in Paris, and I walked to them, and I walked to the cafes where they ate. I couldn't afford to eat in them. They had high tastes. And those cafes, of course, have only become more famous and more fabulous since. But I went around, and funny enough, they lived in very, you know, when we think about 1920s Paris, 1930s Paris, we think Bohemia, you know, we think of the lost generation, but actually Joyce and Nora were older than that set. They were older than the Americans, the Hemingways, the Ezra Pounds, and all of those. And they sort of disdained them a little bit. They didn't really love Bohemia. They were a little bit prissy, a little bit prim, maybe Catholic hangover in that. Joyce didn't like when people swore in front of him. He didn't like dirty jokes. And if you've read Ulysses, you'd be scratching your head. But he didn't. He was quite prim and proper in person. And she was too. I don't know if that was something that rubbed off, because at home she was quite free and easy. In fact, Joyce's sisters found her a little bit uncouth. They were quite middle class, and she wasn't. There's a scene, I think, in Brendan Maddox's biography where Nora puts the chamber pot, like what we'd call a pot or a potty in Ireland, she puts it on the dresser. And his sisters were appalled. This was just such rude behavior, you know. But as they aged, they got a little bit more prim. So yes, where they lived in Paris was generally, you know, in very residential, very sort of boring areas around the Eiffel Tower, if there's such a thing as a boring area in Paris. But like when I was doing my walking, I wasn't on the left bank mostly for where they lived. I was up the way, up near the Eiffel Tower. But first and foremost, they were a family. They were a family doing family things. A lot of his business took place initially in Shakespeare and Co., which was down in the left bank quarter. But he would send Georgia and Lucia down to, you know, run errands for her mom or whatever. And this was another thing about Nora. She was something of a conundrum among the lost generation. She wasn't Joyce's secretary. She was his rock, and she was his anchor, but she wasn't his secretary. She wasn't a literary wife in the way we understand that. She was a different thing. But people who got to know her could see exactly what she was. She minded him. There's a lovely story actually from one of their friends. His name won't come to me just now. Oh, Tom McGreevy, a young Irish fella who went and would visit Joyce to talk. He loved when Irish people came to visit, because he could quiz them about Dublin and then write about it. But he talks about walking behind Nora to a cafe or a restaurant and just watching them and how they looked at each other and smiled. And it really struck him. They didn't just love each other, they liked each other, you know? And this was the 30s. They were well into their relationship at this stage. They were together since 1904. So there was a lot of mutual respect between the two of them. I've gone completely, I don't know where I've gone, but that was them in Paris.
Well, and the emphasis on family, I think, is well played out in the novel. You know, for good and for bad, and yet they always do center there. I'm tempted to ask you if you want to read. I mean, we should just acknowledge Nora's appreciation of her daughter's dancing, as difficult as that relationship could be. There was that. I'm tempted to ask you if you'd want to read from that. I know we're probably also looking at some questions online, but maybe.
I'll just read a tiny bit of it, just to give a teeny flavor, okay?
Thanks.
I won't read as much as I had planned to read. Okay. So they're in the Bal Boulier, which is a sort of a cafe, dance hall-y place in Montmartre, and Lucia is dancing. It's actually a dance competition, and she's in her famous silverfish costume, which you may be familiar with. And I think Beckett is here, isn't he?
I think so.
Yeah, Beckett is here. So Lucia fancied Beckett, who did a lot of work for Joyce, you know, transcribing things. People say he was his secretary, but he wasn't. He was more of a young friend who came and helped him out with some literary, you know, stuff Nora wouldn't do, basically. Joyce would get other people to do it. He was a great man for getting people to do things for him. At one point, I have Nora say, and I think she did say this, sometimes I forget what I've invented and what I haven't. But, you know, if God came down, Jim would find something for him to do, you know, that he just was very good at getting people to do things for him. So they're watching Lucia dance. I'm disgracefully proud of her, I whisper to Jim. He nods furiously, as am I. Every time Lucia's leg rises high or she bends backward, easy as elastic, our little group leans forward as if we're all on strings that are attached to my daughter, to her magical curving body, to her grace. On she goes around the stage, now a trout, quicksilvering through the water, now a bird flitting through the air. To watch her is to be lifted outside of your own body and to become the light animal beam that is Lucia, streaking across the stage. Brava, we call, and when she takes her bow, my stomach grips into a nervy knot, waiting for the results. Lucia will surely take the prize, Mr. Beckett says, and he's smiling, which is something he doesn't do much, and it pleases me that he's as charmed by Lucy's dancing as we are. Lucia doesn't win. The crowd murmurs, then chants, L'Irlandaise, l'Irlandaise. Jim stands and holds his hands to his ear and shrugs at the row of judges. They shrug in return. Do you hear what they chant, he calls, rousing the hecklers to call louder. The result is final, the head judge shouts, and Jim turns his back on him. Lucia joins us at our table, stripped now of her silver shift and cap. Her face is a portrait of misery, and I'm worried she might cry and rage. I'm sorry, my darling, you deserve to win. You astonish us with your gracefulness, I say. Hush, Mama, she whispers, glancing at Samuel Beckett with a disturbed set to her face. I'll just leave it there.
Well done. Well done. I love that. Now a trout.
Oh, poor Lucia.
And are there some Q&A questions?
Yeah, there actually are. There are some interesting questions. One you've touched on them a little bit, but going back to the question of the balance between facts and research and creativity and festooning. I think that's a fabulous word. And the fact that you don't remember if you had made up the quote or if it was really a quote, I think is fascinating. How do you do that balance?
So I guess I started writing this book in 2017, and what I do is I research a little bit to whet my appetite, and then I begin to write, and then I do my research in tandem. Hilary Mantel talks about how the future is blank for your character. She always talks about this, and I kind of like the future to be blank for me, even though I had read Maddox's biography of Nora as a teenager, and even though I knew the basic gist of the Joyce and Nora story, I didn't do too much research straight away. I sort of traveled with them. As I wrote, I researched. And so each chapter feels like Nora is fresh to the situation as she would have been in real life. So the reason I sometimes forget if the quotes are mine or if I've read them somewhere and, you know, twisted them, is because the further I am away from it, so I started it 4 years ago, the more the whole thing just gets interlocked and intertwined, and I start to forget. And sometimes I'm reading back over research just to check a point or something, and I go, oh, okay, I didn't make that up. Oh, that's interesting. You know? Yeah, it's funny how that happens. But like, I'm always very glad to put in real things. So some of Joyce's letters to Stanny, I actually have him say the things to Stanny, his brother, when they're together, so that their conversation echoes real things they talked about in their letters. They were fantastic letter writers, obviously. You know, they don't have what we have now. They didn't have telephone really either. So they wrote these fantastic, chatty, newsy, and between Stanny and Jim, very literary letters. They talked a lot about books they were reading or writers they admired. And, you know, so there's real juice in them for a writer.
And the emotion is something that you can't get in a text, whether it's the author's text or from a letter, and that is something that that is in this novel in volume, gorgeously and penetratingly. So
Thank you.
Yeah, along the lines that somebody asked in this good question, do you need to get permissions to write a biographical novel like you would to write an actual biography?
No, only if you are going to use direct quotes, and I tend not to. I tend to use the very tiniest direct quotes, really barely a sentence. So, for example, when I obviously included the erotic letters, because they're one of the big things about Joyce and Nora, those letters were first published in 1975, so that was an issue. Stephen Joyce was still alive at the time, the Joyce's grandson. He died last January. January 2020, their last remaining direct descendant. But he was quite, litigious and protective, naturally, of his relatives' privacy, and certainly did not like the erotic letters being published, which you can completely understand. But when you're writing a book like this, they are there and it's difficult to ignore them. And people know it. It's a huge part of the Joyce and Nora story. So they were published in 1975, so I couldn't really reproduce them first published because they're still in copyright. I would have had to get permission. So what I did instead was I rewrote them. So I used the thrust, so to speak, of Joyce's words and rewrote them. And then Nora's part of the correspondence is missing, presumed destroyed, might turn up yet, who knows. So I had to write Nora's side of the correspondence. So I did that.
Ah, okay. Okay. And in terms of their writing back and forth, I mean, as you said before, she was not educated, he was educated. Did that have an effect on their relationship and their letter writing and the disparity in their education levels?
Yeah, they were so rarely apart that they didn't write to each other much. And like the first letter that she ever wrote him, she wrote from Finn's Hotel, where she was working in Dublin, to him in Dublin. They wrote to each other, like they could write a few times a day. The post was brilliant back then, obviously, the mail service, I should say. And he criticized her. He said, you used a book to write that letter. That doesn't sound like you at all. But like, we know that probably the only time Nora ever wrote a letter before that was in school for an exercise. So there's every chance she just put on her writer's hat and said, oh, I'm writing now, I have to be formal, because when you write letters, you're a formal person. She wouldn't have known to use her own voice in a letter. It wouldn't have seemed natural to her at all. It's funny, Nora's mother, when a few of her children moved away, none of them wrote to her. So it may have been a family-wide aversion to letter writing, or it may just have been a thing that they just weren't comfortable writing at all. Later on, James Joyce planted the seed for the erotic letters. He said to Nora, oh, there's a particular type of letter that I'd love if you'd write to me. What do you think? So she knew exactly what he meant. And so she wrote the first erotic letter. But, he planted the seed.
Huh. Okay. Huh. And what are you working on next?
I'm writing another historical novel. I have this contemporary novel in my head to write for years, but I keep getting sidetracked by these fantastic, feisty Irish women. So this one is actually, I'm further back in time with this one. I'm back in the 18th century. So a whole new language for me, because I'm used to writing Victorian and now Edwardian type language. So interesting. Yeah, I'm not really saying what it is just yet because I'm not finished.
But it's another biographical novel.
Yes, I actually have a lot more freedom because there is no paper trail. There is a lot of conjecture about this woman, very few facts. So I'm kind of freer to invent. I'm using the sort of evidence that's there, but a lot of the evidence could have been just made up by newspaper people anyway. So yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of freedom, a lot more freedom with this one, which is kind of fun. It's been a fun lockdown project for sure. I started it about a year ago. I thought it was going to be a novella, but yeah, no, it's not. No.
So Peter, do you have more questions, more comments,
Well,
observations?
I want to acknowledge that Nuala is a poet as well, and I think there's something about that enables when a poet can respond to history and bring out emotions and tastes and smells and sounds that we may not have considered. I think it helps us realize that we're not all strangers, really. You know, we live sort of the same type of continuum. We were all young once. We all went through, you know, love and joys and struggle and crisis and loneliness and madness and all of that. And um, I think that's one of the very heartening things about this particular novel and knowing the life of Nora Barnacle. Um, I guess if I had another question in the last couple of minutes, it would be, you know, could you tell us something about the Barnacle family that maybe we don't, just the name alone is wonderful. I love the seashore. Um,
Yeah, it's a fabulous name. It's related to O'Kine in Irish, as in Martin O'Kine, the writer. Something about Nora, she was born in the workhouse in Galway in 1882, March 82, 82, 84, 82, 84. I'm getting confused now. Her second name was Joseph, which is a very Irish thing to give girls boys' names and boys' girls' names. I have an uncle who's, I think, Joseph Mary. So she was Nora Joseph. As I said, she was sent to live with her granny when her mother had twins and just wasn't really able to cope with so many babies. But then, yeah, as I said, also it's that was a very ordinary, normal thing to happen. What
what's
else
that
about
about
her?
the male name and the female name as a middle name? Can you tell us a little bit about
It's
that?
just just a saint thing. It's a way of honoring a saint that either is a family name, so you know she may have had a grandfather or something who was Joseph, or you know in my uncle's case it was to honor the Virgin Mary, so he got Mary, even though it seems like a strange thing to us now. Yeah, I know other women who've had second names that are male names. Yeah, I don't know what else I can tell you. Like the Galway is a medieval port town. It's still laid out as a medieval town, so the streets are very narrow. There's a lot of beautiful stone buildings. Um, it has a very special feel. It's a university town now. It has been a university town since late Victorian era, 1885, I think. The college was founded. Um, but it's now like we have a street theatre group called Machnus, and they're very large. They do spectacles and things like that. Obviously not at the moment with COVID, nothing is happening. It's dreadful.
I think
But
you have a fringe festival in Galway too, don't you?
yeah, a film festival, and you know, there's every kind of festival, big arts festival in July. But when she was there, like there was the Claddagh was the fishing village, which was just a stone's throw from her own home in Newtownsmith. That fishing village would have been all white cottages. The women wore colourful shawls and things. They had a king. They still have a king. It's an honorary title now, but then he really did rule that village. But that village is gone. Like the site of it is there, but the way it looked is gone. Galway had walls and gates, and the Irish were to be kept out. You know, it was it was a colonized city. You know. It's a fabulous place. It's a place of art and culture.
Well, maybe because of your novel, there'll be a Nora tourism born, and
Oh, I did a little listicle actually of 5 places to go if you visit Galway to commune with Nora Barnacle, because there is actually a gin bar called Tea Nora, which means Nora's house. And if you're a drinker, you can have a Nora gin or a James Joyce whiskey. If you're not a drinker, you can have a cup of tea. But it's lovely. And then there's the little Nora Barnacle Museum in Bowling Green, which was her mother's house, 2 rooms, one on top of the other. Lived there with her 7 children. 2 rooms. It's unbelievable, but it's very rarely open. It's privately owned, and it's sort of open. It's usually open on Bloomsday. So that's a good day to go to the Nora Barnacle Museum. Yeah. So, and then the schools she went to are in the center of town. Everything was within little walking distance for Nora when she was young. Yeah, it's very, very lovely.
I think we're all charmed by her life, and I encourage you to pick up Nora, a love story of Nora and James Joyce. And I want to thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Not at all. I just wanted to say to Amy that Andrew Miller is the writer who wrote Eyes Open, Heart Open, or who said, I should say, Eyes Open, Heart Open, Feet on the Ground. Amy just asked the question there. Andrew Miller, who wrote Pure. If you want to read after you've read Nora, Pure, his book is excellent.
And we have another one by him as well. Well, this is a great place to wrap it up. We really appreciate you carving out an hour of your time, and Peter, you as well. And
thank you,
we
Peter.
hope everybody can join us for another event via Zoom. Our next event is our reading group recommendations. And of course, this would be on the list. You could find links to the books in the chat, or just call or email the store. It's easier. We're not open for browsing yet. We're working on it, but we are here every day except Sunday to talk to you about books. And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Very appreciated.
Thank you, Liza. It's been lovely, absolutely lovely.
Great. Well,
have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Nuala.
Take care, everyone.
Talk soon.
Cheers to the book.
Thank you.